Today I'm joined by Annie Barry, accredited dietitian and health coach, specialising in something that we've probably all struggled with at some point in our lives: weight loss. In a world where diet culture has been normalised and we're overwhelmed with options on the supermarket shelves, knowing what is healthy can feel like a minefield. You might have tried fad diets before and found that they worked for a while, but weren't sustainable long term, and the weight came back. In this conversation, Annie shares some of her best hacks and tips for making weight loss sustainable in a way that you won't feel restricted or unable to enjoy the foods you love the most. I think you're going to enjoy this one. Let's get into it. Hi, Annie. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on.
Yeah, me too. I have about 1 million questions for you, so just prepare yourself. I'd love you to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about how you've ended up with your business, All Round Wellness.
My name's Annie. I am an accredited practicing dietitian and health coach. I've been a dietitian for about 19 years now. So over the years, sort of worked in a variety of settings like GP clinic, lymphedema clinic, community health, and also in sort of more health coaching roles like smoking cessation. So a lot of behavior change. So not just around sort of the clinical aspects, but how we actually sort of enact change. So go from knowing things to actually doing things, which is really interesting. I guess for me, I really sort of loved working with women in particular, and I was just really amazed at these beautiful, intelligent women who are just kicking butt in their personal and professional lives, but feeling like failures when it came to weight management because they weren't able to stick to a certain diet. And for me, that sort of really stuck, that I really wanted to, I guess, help these women feel good about themselves and, really drive by kindness and self-compassion versus sort of that drive that usually comes with dieting around kind of self-criticism. And so I started my own dietetics business a few years ago, and now it's my full-time gig. So I get to work with clients that I love every day, which is amazing.
That's amazing. And so you've touched on probably one of my first questions, which is, why is it so hard to manage our weight, and why is dieting and maintaining our weight such a focus for so many people?
I mean, I think at the core of it is, around our desire to fit in and be accepted. It's part of our human condition that we want to be part of a group and part of community. And dieting culture has dictated to us that, our weight equals our worth, and we need to look and weigh a certain number in order to fit in. And so I think that, that's often at the core of it. But dieting's also been really normalised. Like, my mum was on a diet. Some of my clients were put on diets from, childhood. We talk about diets over lunch at work. So it's just become sort of an acceptable part of our culture. And I think marketing as well, like nobody markets better than dieting companies. And who wouldn't want something that promises quick results for no effort? Like we all want that. And so I think, it's a complicated combination of factors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think you're also on the money whenever you say so many women feel quite, they've just not lived up to their own expectations and everyone else's expectations, because they maybe are super successful at work and they've got, a great relationship and everything seems great, but they, are by definition overweight or obese, and they're stuck in this cycle of sort of self-loathing and dieting and on and off diets, and that sort of yo-yo dieting that people talk about. And what do we mean about yo-yo dieting? What actually does that mean?
Common term, but perhaps we don't sort of think about what it actually means. The sort of more scientific term for it, I guess, is weight cycling, which is this process of these weight losses and subsequent regains of body weight. So that cycle, it's typically associated with sort of the dieting practices that we use.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of weight in different age groups, obviously our listenership is very heavily female focused. Do you find that is it harder to lose weight whenever you're 45 or 50 in comparison to whenever you're 25?
I mean, as we know, for the female body, it goes through different iterations over its life stage. In terms of our physiology, that changes over time as well. So, yeah, there's certainly some, hormonal and physiological changes that happen as we age that can make things a little bit difficult. The other thing that happens when we're in that sort of age bracket, 45 plus, is that often we're in a really busy time of life. So we've still got kids who are depending on us. We might have aging parents as well. We might be at that point where our career is really demanding. And so the other thing that happens during that sort of that time period or period of life is that sometimes our lifestyle practices can slip a little bit as well. So we know that women in that age bracket are less active. And, it's hard to take care of, keep all the balls in the air and then add in your nutrition and your exercises as well and juggle all those things. Then for women sort of going through that menopausal transition, we add in some symptoms, anxiety, not sleeping, joint pain, and it just makes all those things even harder to do. So again, it's like there's never any sort of one thing when it comes to weight management and nutrition. There's lots of grey areas and lots of contributing factors. So there's lots of things that contribute to weight management being more challenging at this age and stage.
Yeah, I agree. I work with a lot of perimenopausal and menopausal women, and I feel like it's nearly like the symptoms of that phase of life just tip that ball juggling that women do, and it just seems to tip over the edge for some people, and they can't just keep all the balls in the air anymore. So let's say, I'm 48, I'm postmenopausal, I come to see you. What would your approach be to someone like me to help me with my weight and my eating to make it healthier?
Obviously, when people come and see a dietitian, they think we're going to talk about nutrition, which I absolutely do, but it's also taking a couple of steps back. So thinking about all the influential factors that will influence your choices around food and exercise. So I usually start by having a look at the foundations. So think about sort of building a house. You want to build it on top of really solid foundations. So a couple of things that we would include in those foundations would be things like sleep and stress management, and also medical management as well, whether that be of physical health or mental health. Um, if we've ever sort of not been sleeping, feeling very anxious, it makes it a lot harder to focus on things like your exercise and your nutrition. But also, those sorts of things can influence our hormones as well in terms of driving our hunger as well, which can make things harder. So first things first, we have a look at those foundations so that we've got a really solid block to build off. That was something that I saw a lot during COVID, actually, is that, people were quite stressed, their sleep was affected, and then they were really wondering why they were struggling to get traction in terms of their food and exercise. But it was basically the ship was really wobbly and they were struggling to sort of find the balance. So starting with some solid foundations is really important. Then the next step up, sort of think about these like our walls of our house. We've got our foundations, now we're adding in our walls. So mindset is a big one in terms of the clients that I work with, because a lot of them have been there, done that when it comes to dieting. They've been in that yo-yo cycle for a long period of time. So something that I see really commonly in women who've had a history of yo-yo dieting is that all or nothing thinking. So I'm either on my diet and I'm being really good, or I've fallen off the wagon completely and I'm being really bad. And so what happens is that we just end up with these extremes and we don't end up sort of finding that consistency in the middle. And consistency is what gets results. Also for women, we tend to be our own worst critics. So instead of sort of our mindset coaching us and cheering us along, we tend to drag ourselves down. So I would actually say mindset is a really important factor when it comes to health and weight management, and something that's probably not addressed in our traditional dieting sense. The other wall is things like our systems and our habits. So willpower, discipline, those things will come and go depending on the day, depending on the week. And so what we need are some systems and some plans in place so that we've got those routines to fall back on when that willpower and discipline's not there. reality is for a lot of women, they're running busy lives. So what I found is that, often my clients are logistical masters, getting all their kids to the right sporting events, work, all of that sort of stuff, but they don't include themselves in those systems. So they packed everyone up with a beautiful lunch to take to work and then realize they haven't done anything for themselves. So having some systems in place is really important. So when we've got those foundations and those walls, then sort of the food and exercise is the next level. So in terms of nutrition, some of the extra considerations that we would make sort of for women in that menopausal transition would be supporting our muscle mass with adequate protein, making sure that we're supporting our gut health as well. Hormone changes tend to impact that gut health. So we need to be thinking about our protein, but also our plants and our fiber. And also we can be in a little bit of an inflammatory state. So having a look at sort of lots of our beautiful colored fruits and veg and healthy fats to help sort of support the body. So, it's funny when you look at the whole picture, the nutrition is one part of the puzzle piece. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're slotting in the other bits of the puzzles around it. Sorry, that was a really long explanation.
No, that was amazing. I actually have about 10 questions because of that. So prepare yourself. So obviously I talk a lot to my perimenopausal and postmenopausal women about protein and getting enough in the diet. Can you give me a couple of tips and hints? Because a lot of women go, yeah, I know about the protein. I'm working hard with the protein. But actually in real life, people don't really know how much is more protein and what should they be aiming for, like in real terms. And I also think sometimes whenever we talk in grams or that's very tricky for people to visualize. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of simplify it down into, is it one pork chop or what is it that you're thinking?
There might be differing needs depending on the individuals, but I guess as not a random guide, a general guide. What I usually do with my clients is talk about how we would form a balanced meal or a balanced plate. And so the components of that would be around a quarter of the plate is our protein, about half of our plate are our plants, vegetables, salads, or perhaps even fruits if we're talking breakfast. And then a quarter of our plate will be our whole grains. And so people tend to sort of find that a little bit easier with lunches and dinners. So I'll just sort of mention breakfast first because this is typically the area where women tend not to get enough protein in because our typical breakfast foods like a bowl of cereal or some toast is generally going to be a good source of our carbohydrates and some fiber, but we're missing the protein. So in terms of breakfast options, which are sometimes a little bit harder, eggs are an obvious one, but a lot of people don't necessarily feel like they've got the time to be cooking that up in the morning. So, this is where I might use something like a little bit of protein powder. I don't have my clients chugging protein shakes 24/7, but we might use a little bit of protein powder to enhance, some porridge or some overnight oats. We might use high protein yogurt or baked beans or cottage cheese in terms of helping to increase. So for breakfast, I would just sort of be more focused on getting in a source of protein for starters. So I know we weren't talking grams, but generally sort of 20 to 30 grams is the minimum amount of protein that we'd be looking for in a meal. So in terms of sort of getting that, that's roughly going to be sort of a hand size. If we're having sort of meat or chicken or fish, it's roughly sort of a bit bigger than our palm, probably closer to a hand size. And they're the types of portions that we'd be looking for.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in terms of using like nuts and seeds as well?
Yeah, so it's really difficult because we eat foods, we don't eat nutrients. And so, most foods are a combination of nutrients. So nuts and seeds, have a source of protein. They're also a source of healthy fats. For me, with my clients, when we're looking to lose weight, is that I would tend to count things like our nuts and seeds more as our healthy fat component. There is a sort of fine line between healthy eating and eating for fat loss. And so being mindful of portions of nuts and seeds, if we are looking for weight loss, is something that we look at, but absolutely really important to include those things. So For the purposes of my clients who are mostly looking to lose weight, I would usually sort of think about our nuts and seeds as our fats and flavors. So an important part of the meal, but not the bulk in terms of where we get our protein from.
Okay. And you mentioned protein powder. Can I ask you what your thoughts are on whey-based protein powder?
Or consume sort of dairy-based products. Just a whey protein isolate is usually what I recommend. There's a big difference between sort of a good quality protein powder that has minimal ingredients versus some of the things on the market with lots of fillers, lots of flavors. You can get, birthday cake flavored protein powders that have got lots of stuff in them. So usually for my clients, I'd be recommending something really plain. I usually recommend the raw or unflavored options because often sort of, for many of the whey proteins, the only ingredient is the whey protein versus extra fillers and sweeteners. So yeah, if people are happy to consume dairy, then a whey protein isolate. Otherwise, there's some plant-based alternatives as well.
The only thing that I sometimes see with whey protein is I think it can definitely make some people's skin worse. So if people are having skin issues, I would tend to steer away from that. You mentioned earlier inflammatory foods. What do you mean by that?
Talk about things in terms of anti-inflammatory eating patterns. So rather than sort of demonizing, individual foods, we talk about patterns in general. So for most of us, we want to be following anti-inflammatory eating patterns. But also that's extra important for women going through that menopausal transition. So this is sort of where I guess the Mediterranean diet has come into popularity over the years as well, because that sort of style of eating promotes sort of anti-inflammatory principles. So for that would be minimizing, I guess, our intake of our discretionary foods, so foods that don't sort of look too much like their original ingredients. So these are things that we would sort of commonly label junk foods, so minimizing our intake of our discretionary foods and really maximizing our intake of whole foods, so our fruits and vegetables, whole grains as well, nuts and seeds and healthy fats. Things like our oily fish as well can be really important. So I guess, when we think about eating patterns, we don't necessarily need to demonize foods, or same again, we don't need to put health halos on specific foods. It's about our patterns overall and having a look at what we're doing overall versus sort of worrying too much about each food that we may or may not be eating.
One of the other questions that people seem to be quite puzzled about is oil. Which type of oil to use to cook their food, to use coconut oil or not. And it seems like every time you walk through the supermarket, that oil area of the supermarket just seems to be getting bigger and bigger with more and more oils. And it can become a little bit sort of confusing and people can end up with a bit of analysis paralysis. And obviously, I know that extra virgin olive oil is often sort of trumped as being the healthiest. What are your thoughts on various oils? Which ones would you recommend?
Great question. And anybody who's been online looking at nutrition things will know that it's a very controversial space in terms of people with different arguments. I'm generally in the extra virgin olive oil camp in the sense that it's made up of a good fat profile. Good quality extra virgin olive oil is rich in sort of its antioxidants and polyphenols. And what that does and what that means is it's a very stable oil. So for a little while, there was a bit of debate as to whether or not extra virgin olive oil was a good oil to cook with. The smoke point is reasonably high, but because of that antioxidant and polyphenol content, it actually makes it reasonably stable. So as far as a versatile oil goes, for most cooking, salad dressings, those sorts of things, extra virgin olive oil will always be my pick. I wish I'd sort of bought shares in coconut products, a decade ago, because I think they've been marketed extremely well. I don't think that they're sort of terrible. I don't think that they're the magical products that people are, often sort of market them as. So, yes, for other things, it comes down to the taste profile and the type of thing that you're making that I think will dictate the type of oil that you choose. But first and foremost, I generally recommend an extra virgin olive oil as your main household oil.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And so I'm an Irish girl, as you can tell. We like a potato in Ireland. The great debate is to potato or not to potato. I love potatoes. Are potatoes good for you or not?
Yes, they are. I feel like the poor potato, its reputation has really taken a beating. So when I'm talking about a potato, I am talking about a potato, preferably in its jacket. I'm not talking about a deep fried chip potato that you get at the pub. But in terms of a jacket potato, it's a really great source of fiber and lots of other nutrients as well. There's also what they call sort of like a satiating index, where they have a look at different foods and actually how filling and how satiating they are. And potato ranks really, really highly. And so this is what happens that I see really commonly is when people are trying to lose weight, they end up creating these very light meals. So they take the potato off the plate. We've got, maybe some chicken and some broccoli there, and it's really light, or a salad, tuna salad with some, tuna and lettuce. And what we find is that, they're not satiated, they're not filling up. So then they'll end up being hungry, they'll need to snack later. So my preference is to build really filling and satisfying meals. And a potato is a really great source of that sort of carbohydrate and fuel, and also something that's going to be really satiating. Another argument in the potato camp is that we know that cooked and cooled starches, resistant starches, are very good for us in terms of our gut health. So this is something like a potato salad. We cook it and cool it. It's a really good source of the resistant starches, which is great for our gut. So I'm definitely team potato.
Okay, so potato salad, good, tick. Baked potato, good, tick. French fries, as we all know, probably not so healthy, maybe occasionally kind of thing. In terms of things like pasta, so I do feel like a lot of women of my vintage often feel like they can't have pasta, they can't have bread, they can't have potatoes because they're trying to manage their weight. Is that similar to potato, or what are your thoughts on those ingredients?
Absolutely. And I guess I should also preface this by saying that people will have different needs, different allergies and tolerances, other things. But just sort of speaking generally, certainly we don't need to cut out these sorts of foods in order to lose weight. What we do know is that particularly females, as we get a little bit older and our hormones start to shift and change, that our ability to utilize our carb fuels is blunted a little bit. So we do need to moderate our intake, but we don't actually need to cut it out. So helping my clients sort of understand portions and how they can work these foods into their days and into their weeks is something that I do. There is, I guess, a little bit of reasoning that we would want to be eating these foods perhaps a bit earlier in the day when we are a little bit more metabolically active. So, breakfast and lunches versus kind of having a really, really heavy dinner. But then, there's also what's perfect versus what's practical in terms of our lifestyles as well. So it does come down to moderating and portion size versus needing to cut out. Actually, in terms of the research around weight management, what that shows is that, as long as our calories and protein are where they need to be, our carbs and fats can actually fall where they fall. This comes down to personal preference. So, keto is not necessarily superior to a different style of weight loss diet. It's about finding the right pattern and style that works for you.
Sometimes I have patients who come to see me who have a lot of weight to lose, and they can feel a bit overwhelmed and disheartened. They've maybe dieted before, and they have done that yo-yo dieting thing where they've lost weight and regained it, and it is really hard. Like, all the research does tell us that there's a little switch in our brain that wants to take us back to our heaviest weight. But do you have any hacks or tips to, once you've lost that weight, what are the things to do to make it more possible to keep the weight off?
A really good point, and it's a really big challenge. And a part of the issue is that, every program, everything we do is geared towards the weight loss phase, and there's not really sort of a focus on that maintenance phase and what we do. And the body is ultimately just wanting to keep us safe, and it's geared for survival. And, sometimes it will see weight loss as a bit of a threat. And so we need sort of some strategies in order to help counteract this. So I think, I'll just talk sort of lifestyle in general. We know there's sort of surgeries and there are weight loss medications, which are really valid strategies and valid tools for people. For me, sort of working in the lifestyle space, I'll just kind of talk about lifestyle habits. But hopefully, sort of when people are losing weight, we've adapted adopted some habits that you are able to continue. So what we know is that you need to maintain a portion of the habits that you use to lose weight in order to keep it off. And so again, that's sort of making sure that you've adopted a lifestyle that you're happy to live, versus something that you feel like you want to do for a really short time. And then when it's over, if you go away, you just want to go back to what you were doing before. So I often say sort of start as you wish to continue. So having a think sort of longer term when we're starting versus kind of just get the weight off and then sort of think, oh gosh, how do I keep it off? Moving your body, we know that exercise is important for weight maintenance. So prioritizing that time for movement is really important. So when it comes to weight loss, I often say nutrition is king and exercise is queen. Like nutrition is the number one important factor. When it comes to weight maintenance, I would say that exercise probably sort of comes into its own a little bit and is a really good helper. Self-monitoring is important. So we're human. Over time, we can become a little bit complacent. So it's natural if you've lost some weight and you've been sort of quite vigilant in terms of your food and your exercise. Over time, these things can start to slip. So you might sort of drop a nutrition habit, you might drop off an exercise session or two a week, and it's natural that these things happen over time. So what we know about successful weight maintainers is that they keep a bit of an eye on things. So if they start to see that the scale might be creeping up or their like waistband on their pants is feeling a little bit snug, these are gentle reminders to just sort of start having a look at things again and perhaps sort of making a couple of changes. So it's just like those little like self-correction. So, when you're driving, you're constantly sort of moving the steering wheel, just sort of self-correcting. And so this is the same thing when we're looking to maintain weight. We sort of need to keep an eye on things and just make those little self-corrections, versus sort of just ignoring it, putting our head in the sand and then time passes.
I love that analogy. That's actually, really, really smart. And I'm going to steal that one and use it with my patients. So that's so good.
Awesome.
And just on that same subject, and obviously if someone has an eating disorder or whatever, that's completely different. But what does the evidence say about weighing ourselves? Like, should we weigh ourselves once a week, once a month? Is weighing yourself a good thing to do or not?
That really depends on the individual. So the research suggests that a way of self-monitoring is important, but it doesn't sort of dictate that one way is superior than another. So, you could use the scales, or you could use, the waistband of your clothes, or you could use a tape measure. So there's lots of different ways that you can monitor your progress that doesn't necessarily rely on the scales. So in terms of what's right, it comes down to the individual. So some of my clients are using the scales, but for others, the scales create a lot of anxiety and can dictate their mood. And actually, I guess the cons definitely outweigh the pros, so we don't use the scales. So yes, we definitely know we need a way of sort of getting a sense of where things are at, our yardstick, but it doesn't have to be the scales if you don't want it.
And what are your thoughts on using the BMI measurement? That has definitely come under a lot of discussion recently, and while it was definitely the flavor of the month for a number of years, a lot of people are saying that BMI is not a good measurement. What are your thoughts on that?
To be honest, I never used BMI with my clients. So, if we think about what it was designed originally for, it was designed as a population measure, yet somehow we sort of have then applied it to individuals and then also made a judgment that if your BMI is sitting at a certain place, then that indicates something about your health. Whereas, we know that that's not necessarily the case. So, yeah, it's not something that I use in my practice. I don't use it when we're thinking about sort of our goals or what directions that we're heading. And I think that it potentially can do more harm than good.
And so do you use waist measurements, or what do you use in your practice?
Would differ between clients. So my rule is if we are using the scales, then we need to use a tape measure as well, because we know that the scales will tell us what we weigh, but it doesn't tell us what's fluid, what's fat, what's muscle, what's food in our gut, all of those things. So the scales definitely have limitations. So most of my clients are using probably the scales and a tape measure as well. But as I said before, some clients aren't using the scales at all. And often, if we're setting goals, we'll talk about my clients have often been a range of different weights over time. And we talk about where they felt good at, and also rather than thinking about what you want your body to weigh, is thinking about what do you want your body to do. Is it about getting on and off the floor to play with the grandkids, or is it about wanting to be fit so that you can travel and climb a mountain? Because often that will then kind of dictate our goals versus kind of picking a random arbitrary number that might not actually be meaningful.
One of the things that I sometimes do with my patients is to do a DEXA scan to have a look sort of at the beginning and the end of a program to see where we are in terms of fat loss and muscle loss and gain. And, there's definitely been a lot of chat in the media about people losing a lot of muscle when they lose weight. And it's been chatted a lot about with Ozempic, the weight loss injection, but it is possible for anyone who loses substantial amounts of weight to lose quite a lot of muscle. Isn't that right? And so is there anything that people should be doing to try and counteract that muscle loss? Because obviously as I say, we have a lot of listeners of that perimenopausal, postmenopausal age. We don't want them to lose any more muscle because they're already losing muscle. So how would you approach that?
It's a really good point because often, we're conditioned to talk about weight loss, but actually what we're talking about is fat loss. That's the stuff that we want to lose. And it's natural that we will lose a little bit of muscle mass as our body gets smaller. But what we want to do is that we want to minimize that percentage. So I guess a couple of things that I do with my clients is that we tend to be a little bit more conservative in terms of our approach. So we're not sort of super aggressive and really drastically cutting back their food. We're a little bit more conservative so that we're fueling the body with enough energy, but also enough protein as well in terms of helping to protect that muscle mass. So again, coming back to the protein. And for this age group as well, like strength training is really important. We do sort of get to a point where if you don't move it, you lose it. So having a look at the activity and the exercise that you're doing to sort of promote that muscle gain is really important. So I think probably a slightly more conservative rather than aggressive weight loss approach, making sure we're getting enough protein and doing some strength training as well can be really
And
helpful.
is there an advantage to losing weight quickly versus, slow and steady wins the race?
There's a couple of schools of thought in the sense that, losing weight quickly can help with engagement and can help with buy-in. If you're seeing change and seeing results, that helps keep us motivated. Whereas sometimes that slower and steadier path can be a little bit frustrating. So again, it depends on the person and depends on the situation. For a lot of my clients, they've been there, done that with the rapid weight loss, and they've done that multiple times over. And so they're sort of looking for a different approach, which is why I sort of go in that slower and steadier approach. But in some circumstances, more rapid weight loss might be beneficial for that individual and their circumstance.
And you don't, it's not dangerous to lose weight too quickly, or?
Yes, I guess it depends sort of what we're talking. In my head, I'm kind of thinking more of a supervised rapid weight loss plan versus somebody doing something extreme on their own. So yes, there can certainly be dangers.
What are the mistakes that you commonly see people making, both in terms of, what they're doing and I suppose what they're thinking?
Yeah, so I would say that a really common mistake, which I touched on before, was that less is best mentality. So trying to go really light, eating less, and what happens, as I mentioned before, is that we can tend to make ourselves hungry in the sense that, okay, we've been really light during the day, I've been so good, and then we get to that afternoon and then we're starving, and so then people tend to overeat in the afternoon and into that evening. So going too light, I think, is a really common mistake. I touched on another one before, was just that all or nothing thinking. So feeling like we need to be perfect in order to get results. Whereas in actual fact, consistency over time gets results. We don't need to be perfect. And so I find people keep looking for that clear run, I don't have any social occasions on, or I'm home, or I can do this. Whereas in actual fact, like we've got to kind of make our approach work with life, because things are always going to pop up and are always going to get in the way. And so waiting for that perfect time where we can do the perfect diet is often a mistake that I see people make.
Annie, how long would your average client work with you for?
Yeah, so for me, I work one-on-one with people over a period of, probably about 4 months on average. It can, it varies. So I have around 5 sessions over that time, and people can contact me in between. So, traditional kind of clinical setting for dietitians is that you go in, you see somebody once, maybe twice, we give you your little sheets and off you go, which is the setting that I worked in for many, many years. But what I've realized when it comes to weight management in particular, that the accountability and the support is really important. And the research suggests that as well. Having support, whether it be, from a health professional or in a community or with some buddies or colleagues, is really important for success. And so that's why I work with people over a period of time to give them that support.
And do you see the same clients coming back to you, or have you got repeat clients?
I probably haven't been in business quite long enough to have that yet. People definitely do check in. So after they've sort of completed the program with me, like I'm happy to check in with clients. So people like to check in, and as I mentioned before, that's that that self-monitoring, like just keeping on top of things, keeping an eye on things. So yeah, I definitely have people checking in who have sort of graduated, but they might pop in every 3 months or so just for a check-in and a chat and a tune-up. But yeah, I haven't had too many people bouncing back yet, but give me a few more years, perhaps I'll start to see that.
At the very beginning of our conversation, you talked a lot about sort of motivation and mindset and willpower, and I absolutely 100% agree. It's one thing to give someone, a big book of eating, of an eating plan, but if someone's just not in the right mindset, then it's probably going to be a bit of a struggle. I'd love to know how you approach that, and maybe some tips that you could give to our listeners about maybe helping to change their mindset a little bit.
So we know that information doesn't equal transformation. And so a lot of us have got all the information. We've looked at all the websites. We follow a billion influencers on Instagram. But it's about sort of helping to bridge that gap. So for me, sometimes it's just helping break it down for clients. So often sort of they're at that, like the bottom of a mountain. They know they need to get to the top of the mountain, and they're just staring up there, wondering how they're going to get there. And so just being able to break down the steps, so thinking about those ladder steps, just the first steps in front, people can start to see that pathway. And also when you break it down into small enough steps, it starts to feel realistic and feel practical and feel doable. Whereas often sort of we've created this giant thing in our minds of, I've got to start fasting, and then I've got to cut out my carbs, and then I shouldn't be drinking, so I can't go to this. We create these sort of really big loops that make things seem impossible. So often it's just sort of breaking it down and simplifying things as well, saying here's the overall themes of the types of things that we want to do, and here are the little mini steps that you can do in between, and then people can start to see that pathway.
Would you suggest that a small goal versus a large goal? So would you suggest breaking, like if someone has a large amount of weight that they feel they want or need to lose, like let's say someone needs to lose 30 kilos, would you say to break that down into 5 or 10 kilogram bites rather than saying, oh, we're going to lose 30 kilos by, Christmas?
So I think always having little small milestones along the way. And it also means that we celebrate those as well, because the other thing, this is another big mistake my clients often make, is they forget to celebrate the wins, particularly all those little wins that they're having. And so if we have smaller goals and little milestones, it helps us stop and reflect how far we've come and celebrate those wins. Because when we do that, that helps build that momentum and that confidence as well. Whereas most of us are sitting in that point thinking of all the things that we haven't done yet or we should do, versus like, oh, I've managed all these things and I've put all these things in place. Because often there's non-scale victories as well, in terms of people are feeling better, or their blood pressure or cholesterol improves. their energy's improved, their digestion's better, they're able to keep up with the kids a bit more at the park, all of those little things that, aren't necessarily sort of scale wins, but are really important when it just comes to quality of life and enjoying our life.
One of the things that I find with a lot of my patients is that whenever they do hit a goal, they often reward themselves with alcohol or food. Is that something that you see, and is it something that you think is okay, or something that you try and steer your clients away from doing?
Different. So for most of my clients, we don't necessarily cut out all of those things. So they haven't given up their alcohol, or they haven't given up their chocolate or their favorite foods. So what we do, the reason that we do that is it removes that forbidden fruit effect a little bit. So, that time when you're like, oh, I've been restricting this for so long, I can't wait to indulge. So, what I find is if we are including these things along the way, then there's less of that forbidden fruit and less of that desire to need to reward ourselves. But just a note in terms of food and alcohol, like it's a really common thing that we use as a reward. It's there, it's accessible, it's easy. And it's okay if we use it as a reward or managing our emotions, whether that be stress or boredom or sadness, any of those sorts of things. It becomes an issue when they're the only tools we have in our toolbox as a reward, or either something that we manage as our emotions. So it's okay to use food and alcohol sometimes. It's just if that's the only thing that we're using, then it becomes sort of counterproductive to our goals.
Yeah, I had a patient recently, and what she did was she popped all the money in a little jar that she wasn't spending on her caramel double latte every morning, and then she went off and had like her hair done and everything. So that was kind of her treat. So we're definitely trying to steer away from that. And I agree, I think whenever people go, oh, I'm going to completely stop drinking, and I'm not going to go out for dinner, and I'm not going to have takeaway, and I'm not going to do this, like long term, that's not going to be how you're going to live your life. And so it's really about getting people to reduce their alcohol so that most of the week they don't have a drink and things like that, because there's definitely so many calories in alcohol that people probably aren't thinking about.
Alcohol's a tricky one, and it's a tricky one for the clients that we're working with as well, because again, there's that busyness and that stress of life, and so alcohol's sort of often used as that crutch or that sort of wind down or de-stressor. So having a look at our relationship with alcohol and having a look at some alternatives as well. Because if we just take it away, reality is you still need to wind down and de-stress, but we just need some of the strategies to put in place.
Annie, we're coming into winter here in Australia, and it always encourages you to probably eat a little bit more heavy food. Have you any hints or tips to how to get through the winter and not come out the other side 5 kilos heavier?
It's of concern for clients. So we still use the same sort of strategies. So this is where a beautiful cooked potato could come in terms of it being really warming and comforting. So it's sort of, instead of thinking about sort of, I guess, lighter, more summery meals like our meats and proteins and salads, is that we would just think about still those same sort of things, that we still want to prioritize our protein and our veg. We can just do it in different ways. And so that could be thinking about, beautiful veg-laden soups and stews and curries. We can still create sort of those warming comfort foods, but still with that nice balance of protein and veg. So I think it's just sort of reminding ourselves that we still need to make sure that everything is veg heavy and still using some good quality sources of proteins, but just creating that nice balance with our plate. So same sort of theory applies. It's just slightly different foods, but yeah, soups and stews and curries can be great. Spray dates can be great in terms of roasted veg and other things. Can be awesome during winter as well. The other thing I would recommend is have a nice jacket and a beanie handy so that you can still get out the door and go for a walk. Certainly I'm in Melbourne. Like, reality is there's not that many days where it's sort of pouring with rain. It can be nippy, but it's still nice to get out. So I think just trying to still make it outdoors for some fresh air is important too.
I am sorry, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit now about specific foods that lots of women seem to talk a lot about. So bread. Everyone seems to be a little bit confused about bread, whether bread's good for you. Should they only be having sourdough bread or bread brought from a bakery, not the supermarket. And I know that you're always very good about saying everything in moderation, but where are we with the whole bread scenario?
Same as sort of potatoes and pasta in the sense that it can be a really good, we can get a really good source of whole grains and fiber from a good quality bread. So usually sort of a bread that's based around wholemeal and whole grains would be my preference. There's great breads at bakeries, but we've also got some really great supermarket breads as well. So, expense is not necessarily equate to quality, as long as we're looking for wholemeal flours and whole grains where we can, there's a lot of great supermarket brands and other brands as well. Comes down to quantities and comes down to sort of pairing it, making sure that we are, again, sort of with carbs, we want carbs to have friends with them. So making sure that we've got some protein and some plants coming in as well. But, a good old sandwich, like they've really gone out of favor, but having a sandwich with some protein and a big whack of salad can be a really satisfying lunch, meaning again that's going to reflect well in terms of our snacking and our sort of satiation later in the day. So yeah, I do think bread's probably been a little bit demonized with the potato, but if we're using good quality and in the right proportions, then I would think it can be an asset to our diet.
I've noticed recently there's breads with added protein. Is that a gimmicky thing, or are they a reasonable purchase?
So, protein's obviously in fashion at the moment because you'll see that everything in the supermarket is now got added protein. There's certain situations where I would use those types of products, like the higher protein breads. So an example might be, if somebody's running out the door and they just want a bit of toast and Vegemite in the morning, using a protein bread can be really helpful because it at least sort of then starts you off the day with some protein. The other time I might use it is if you've got sort of a soup that might be more of a veggie base. Having a slice of protein toast on the side can be a really helpful way just to boost up the protein in the meal. I'm not going to pretend that they taste like yummy fresh bread because the texture is actually different. So good for toast, not so good for sandwiches. There's a couple of, as I said, there's a couple of circumstances where these sorts of products can be really helpful.
Cheese. What do you think about cheese? Lots of women tell me that they give up their husband but not give up cheese. So what are your thoughts on cheese? How much cheese is too much cheese?
I think 10 years ago, I probably would have been a bit tighter around cheese. But, I think also, and again, this comes down to individual tolerances as well, but assuming that you can tolerate cheese and tolerate dairy, then again, I think it can be an asset. I would usually sort of put cheese more in our fats and flavors category versus a source of protein. Probably cottage cheese is the exception to that. So I definitely think that cheese can be a really something that can add flavor to foods and also add a little bit of fats and protein as well. So again, I'm pro cheese.
What is it about cottage cheese? I can remember even as a child in the 1980s in Ireland, my mother being on a diet and having cottage cheese. It looked revolting to me, and I have to admit I've never willingly ate it. But what is it about cottage cheese that's so great?
It's also protein, and I guess it's a non-meat option as well. So for people who aren't eating meats and are eating dairy, then cottage cheese can be a lean source of protein. It's also pretty versatile. Again, I was grossed out by it for so many years because it, just that texture. But now that I've eaten it as an adult, I'm like, actually, it's pretty good. It's really versatile. So things that my clients might do in terms of savory versions, they could mash it with avo so that then they've got cottage cheese and avo on toast. That's a nice high protein meal. It can also go sweet as well. So sometimes people might put a little bit of honey and cinnamon and have it with berries or berries on toast and those sorts of things. So it's reasonably cheap, pretty versatile, and a really good source of protein and a nice easy one for either meals or snacks.
And I'm sorry, I know I'm just picking your brain here constantly, but sugar and versus artificial sweeteners. I feel like artificial sweeteners definitely went out of fashion, maybe, I don't know, a while ago, and they seem to have come back in a little bit again, and that zone again in the supermarket seems to be ever increasing, and it does feel a little bit confusing.
Really good point. And I think, again, there's a lot of sort of misinformation traveling around. So we know we do need to minimize or reduce our added sugars. In terms of artificial sweeteners, so I tend to sit on the fence in terms of it comes down to the amount that you're consuming. So for all of my clients, they might want the odd diet soft drink or, Coke Zero every now and again. And for me, I would say that that's absolutely fine. So the general consensus is that artificial sweeteners are safe within sort of small to moderate consumption. So in terms of what I advise my clients to do, it probably just depends on the person and the situation.
Well, I know that myself and some of the girls I work with went through a bit of a phase there, and we were having a little bit too much Diet Coke. And then I did read quite an interesting clinical study, which did seem to show that despite not having any sugar in it, diet drinks can really influence your insulin and absorption really for hours and hours after you've actually consumed the drink. So I think they're perhaps not just quite as calorie neutral as we would be led to believe.
There's also, that there'll be more research to come, particularly on the impact around the gut microbiome as well, which is something to consider. So yeah, I think they're not the magic substance that we probably thought they were maybe in the 80s and the 90s. But again, it comes down to creating sort of a balance overall. And so I don't stress too much if there's an odd Diet Coke coming in, but I guess it can be common, I guess, from a weight management perspective that people might use these products more as an appetite suppressant, and can affect sort of the other nutrition that we're consuming. So for sure, it's not something that I would recommend in big quantities.
Yeah, I definitely had a patient recently and she was having 6 Diet Cokes a day and then really not having any food. So yeah, that was challenging, and she kind of felt that it was actually quite addictive. She was struggling to give up the. You're nodding. You've had people like that as well. Annie, do you have any patient stories that you can share with us that might sort of give some of our listeners a little bit of inspiration, or direction as to where to go on their own journey?
Generally, so something that people don't or might not realize is that, as an accredited dietitian, I'm sort of required to operate under certain guidelines. And so one of those things is that I can't necessarily share clinical outcomes like this patient lost this amount of weight and their cholesterol improved by this much. But I can talk about sort of general experiences and things that people have had. Probably one client that sticks in my mind quite a lot, we'll call her Sue. So Sue, I think, was late 50s, and again had been there, done that in terms of her diet. Probably her most recent had been shakes. She'd also been on Ozempic and had lost about 10 kilos, but then had difficulties with supply issues and regained that weight. And she was feeling pretty sort of flat about everything. She was a little bit skeptical, I guess, sort of starting to work with me because it was like, well, how is this going to be different to everything else that I've done? So we just got really, really simple changes in terms of, we've talked about sort of the plate and portioning her plate. So it wasn't about changing the types of foods that she was cooking, but just changing the proportions that were on the plate. We talked about sort of snacks on the go. She was often babysitting her grandkids and was in and out, and so would often just be eating whatever was around. So more of a sort of victim of her environment and circumstances versus being planned and prepared. And purely just by those things, we actually made some really big inroads for her in terms of our progress, and she was feeling better. The other thing that I often do with my clients, and we did with this particular client, is thinking about her week as a whole, because what she was doing again was that sort of perfectionist mindset. She was trying to get every day perfect. And then when she would go out for dinner, she couldn't enjoy her meal because she'd be sitting there going, oh, like I've stuffed it now. She was feeling guilty before she'd even finished the meal, and was really struggling to enjoy her social occasions. So learning how to think about her week as a whole and balancing her week was a really sort of positive mind shift for her, because it meant that didn't mean that every little decision she made every day was life or death, that she could figure out how to balance her week. And for her, sort of, this is why she sticks in my head, is that she sort of said, I don't feel like I'm on a diet at all. This is easy. It's not a big deal. And for her in the past, it had always felt like dieting was, climbing that mountain, and it was this big slog. And so that transformation from having that sort of slog and trying to be perfect and that constant sort of guilt cycle to something that sort of almost felt too easy, that she felt like she was cheating it, but that it felt good, and that was a massive shift for her. And so I think it's just remembering that you can create habits and lifestyles that feel good. It doesn't have to be that mammoth uphill slog, and that there is room for meals out and enjoying social occasions, and understanding that consistency sort of trumps intensity or perfection.
As you said, like the patient you're talking about, lots of people struggle with snacks. They're running around, they've maybe been really busy, they've left work, they're now picking someone up from school and taking them to ballet or whatever. And there's just this endless round of running around, and it's trying to have snacks maybe in your car or in your handbag that are going to be reasonable. Do you have any little hints or tips of good snacks? Like I sometimes say things like, a handful of almonds, or sometimes like dried apricots, because a lot of my patients are iron deficient and things like that. But have you any other little hints and tips of things that you think are handy to carry around?
Yeah, I think, this is where sort of that having some plan B options are really important. So being a dietitian, I'm always going to be telling people to eat their fruit and some veggie sticks and, maybe a yogurt. But in reality, sometimes you need some of those portable snacks that are going to be able to sit in your car or your handbag, and, making life easy. So nuts are a really great one in terms of providing sort of high level of nutrients. There are some reasonable sort of nut bars and things on the market. There's a Carmen's almond bar that my clients sort of often will use. Cheese and bickies, or even like little Baby Bell cheeses, can be really helpful in the sense that they can survive sort of being out of the fridge for a little bit and don't go sort of yuck.
That's all right. It's tricky. It's always nice to think that you're going to chop up all these veggies and have your little tub with your hummus and your capsicum and celery. But then, I find it in my handbag 2 days later going, oh, I completely forgot to eat that.
That was good.
That was great. I'm really glad that I did that. And then I just pop it in the bin. Okay. And I promise you, this is my last question. Non-dairy milks, those are obviously, again, have absolutely exploded. I have to admit, we've been drinking oat milk in our family for 15 years because of some allergies with my children. So it was long before it was popular. In fact, it was very hard to get at that stage. But what are your thoughts on those milks? Because it does seem to be that every time I go to the supermarket again, that area is expanded. I think supermarkets are going to end up the size of aircraft hangars with all these expansion in ingredients that we're seeing. But is there any of those non-dairy milks that you think are better than others in terms of nutritional value?
Jen, I would say that, with nutrition, the answer to every question is it depends. So, I just want to sort of firstly say that, with cow's milk, animal milk, that if you tolerate that and that works well for you, like you don't have to swap to a plant milk. I think that's sort of also people have been thinking, should I be swapping to a plant milk? It comes down to your individual circumstances and preferences. So in terms of some of probably I would say, I guess almond milk and oat milk are probably the two really common varieties, as well as perhaps soy milk. If I had to choose in terms of a favorite plant milk, I'd probably go soy, just because it's a nutritional profile. It's got that good source of protein in it, which is similar to cow's milk. One thing that I would say is that we definitely need to be having a look at milks that have been calcium fortified. Certainly bone health is something that we need to be mindful of. And a lot of the plant milks aren't fortified with calcium. So we kind of think that it's a direct swap and that we're getting our serve of dairy alternatives, but a lot of them aren't fortified. So you just need to double check the back of your pack to make sure that you're getting a fortified option. Something like an almond milk, is really low calorie, so it's very popular in the weight loss world, but again, might not be fortified with calcium, and it's also very low in protein. So, something like a cow's milk or a soy milk sort of comes with some protein inbuilt. Almond milk, lower calorie, but no protein. So there's lots of kind of different things to consider. But one thing that I would say is, yes, definitely be mindful of the calcium.
And oat milk, is there protein in oat milk?
No, so oat milk sort of sits in the middle in that sense, that it's sort of, it's not as low calorie as something like an almond milk, and there's not much protein in oat milk.
Okay, amazing. Okay, well, I think I've probably exhausted you asking a million questions. Is there anything that you feel that you would love to share that I haven't picked your brain about yet?
The message that I want to get out to people in the world is that, I think it is important that we look after ourselves, and in the end, this is about sort of making ourselves feel great and being able to lead the lives that we want to lead, and that you don't necessarily need to get to a certain number on the scale to do that. So think about what you want your body to do rather than what you want your body to weigh, and always motivate through kindness and compassion rather than that self-criticism, because that completely changes the journey for people.
Annie, if people who don't live in the Melbourne area wanted to work with you, is that possible?
Yeah, so I'm actually online only. So all my consults are run online via video chat. You can find me at allroundwellness.com.au, or I am on Instagram at healthy.habits.dietitian.
Amazing. Annie, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. That has been fantastic.
No worries. Thank you so much for helping me, and I hope it was useful.
I completely forgot. I have to ask you one question that I ask all my viewers. What's the piece of advice that you would give your 20-something self?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I think it is just reminding myself that life isn't a dress rehearsal. Like, this is it. So don't sweat the small stuff. Like, just get out there and enjoy it. I'm definitely someone who can sweat the small stuff sometimes and get stuck in my head a little bit. So just telling my younger self just to not worry about it and just enjoy.
I hear you. I love that. Thank you.
No worries.
I think you'll agree we've had some incredible guests on the podcast already, and today's was no exception. I think there is so many nuggets of information I'd love to get out there. So if you know someone who would benefit from the podcast, please share it. That way more people can learn all about themselves. Remember, this podcast is all about you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.